It's my great pleasure to present Rocio Joo. Rocio is a senior data scientist at Global Fishing Watch, where she oversees the development of fishing and vessel models, research effort on forced labor, and she coordinates partnership with Latin America. She obtained her bachelor degree in statistics engineering at Universidad Nacional de Ingeniería in Peru, and then a master's degree in biostatistics and a PhD in ecosystem at Université de Montpellier in France. I know Rocio from her work on movement model, which is really extensive and integrative, but she recently revealed that she plays the drum, including in an impromptu band that she created with others at Global Fishing Watch, which she told me was called the Outer Tunas, which I thought was very apropos. So please join me in welcoming Rocio. Rocio, take it away.
Thank you very much, Marie, for the introduction. Um, so yes, as Marie just mentioned, I am part of the research team at Global Fishing Watch, and we work a lot with different technologies to render transparent the human activity at sea. So I'm just going to briefly talk about Global Fishing Watch first and what we do and how we can collaborate with others, and then go to one of our research lines of work, which is forced labor. So Global Fishing Watch promotes ocean governance through greater transparency of human activity at sea. By creating and publicly sharing maps, data, and analysis tools, we facilitate scientific research and promote change in the way we manage our oceans. And one of our main goals is that by 2030, we're aiming to monitor and visualize the impact of marine vessels responsible for the majority of the global fish catch. In terms of research and collaborations, we develop algorithms, produce data, and work with partners so that our results respond to global, regional, and local challenges. Our partners come from academia, government agencies, NGOs, and international organizations. We publish scientific studies. Some of them are led by us, some are not, and we also publish reports. There are many ways to collaborate. In case anybody in the room is interested, by sharing experiences with fisheries and fishery-related problems or human at sea related problems, by sharing data or working together on data analyses and research or many other avenues. So at the end of the talk, I will share my email address in case anybody is interested in collaboration. Now, one of our lines of work is forced labor. So that is what I'm going to talk about today. That is, I lead the research part of that work. Forced labor is a type of modern slavery, and it has been defined by the International Labor Organization as all work or service exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty and for which the said person has not offered themselves voluntarily. The issue has gotten a lot of international attention, and here I'm showing the covers of a sample of reports. We have on the left a Greenpeace report, on the center an Environmental Justice Foundation report, and on the right side a report from Ian Urbina in the New Yorker. They are all quite recent, and they are all focused on forced labor at sea. Even though there is international attention to this problem, uh, a big limitation is that it's very difficult to see what's happening at sea. So models can help shed light on where forced labor happened. And this first part of the presentation is about some work that I'm leading to identify fishing vessels associated with forced labor based on movement patterns and vessel characteristics. The idea here was to train the model on reported cases of forced labor and then predict for all the rest of vessels for which we don't know if forced labor happened. Reported cases of forced labor are those that we have obtained through desk research with that we have found um, on the media or sometimes embassy reports, different embassy reports, um, other NGO reports. So we've taken everything that had testimonies of witnesses or victims or prosecutions or arrests, and that had to do with the ILO defined 11 forced labor indicators. So we take those that have information of a combination of those indicators. It doesn't have to be the 11. So we train a model on those reported cases, and we want to predict for all fishing vessels worldwide. And the main challenge here is that there is poor and biased data to train our model. There are few reported cases for many reasons. Victims, not all victims can report. To, not all victims have opportunities to report forced labor. Uh, some are trapped in vessels, some die, uh, and not all of them get to see inspectors. In many cases, this happens when the crew are mostly composed of migrants. Um, some can arrive to port, but there are no translators, there are no mechanisms. So it's a very complicated system in general that makes it hard to report. And so as a result, in terms of data, we have few reported cases. There is no sampling design. There is no probabilistic sampling to go at sea and inspect. And actually, that is part of the problem. And that's why a model is so important to help us see what is happening. The dates of abuses are not exact. Sometimes crew members don't know exactly when forced labor happened. Sometimes they don't know exactly when they are on board a vessel. In some cases, there's trafficking, and the victims or the crew go from one vessel to another, and they don't know exactly when they were in a vessel. We are lucky when they have the name of the vessel. Um, and sometimes we have the dates, and sometimes we have the date of the report. So we have done a lot of desk research, and in some cases assumptions, to get at least the year where this happened. And that's why our model is on a yearly basis. Um, Another challenge is that we only have positive cases to train. Positive means positive on forced labor. So we only have reported cases of forced labor, but we are not 100% sure that in any other vessel, nothing happened throughout a year. So that's why the modeling approach that we are taking here is something called PU learning approach. So it's a machine learning approach with something called PU, positive unlabeled, because you don't have the classic positive and negative cases to train them on. And a last thing, the last bullet point here is that we don't have many, let's say, what we would think directly informative covariates for this kind of modeling. I guess that ideally we would want to have the list of crew workers, if they are migrants, if they have contracts, if they have health insurance, uh, what are the living and working conditions at sea in the vessels. But that is very hard to find for most vessels in the world. So we need to use covariates that we can have for most vessels in the world. And that comes from AIS data. So AIS data, AIS means Automatic Identification System. And there is, so the idea here for this system is that vessels vessels transmit positions to avoid collision. So they transmit to this satellite and terrestrial receptors. They receive the messages and they transmit it to the other vessels around. So vessels know where other vessels nearby are. That's how they avoid collision. Global Fishing Watch has access to most of the AIS data in the world, and we use it with different algorithms to detect fishing activity and other activity that is happening at sea with that geolocation data. And this AIS data represents about from 50 to 200 geolocations per vessel per day. We also use at Global Fishing Watch other types of data, of satellite data, but this is the one that is used for the forced labor model. And this is what it looks like when we map all the vessel activity that we got from AIS data from 2012 to 2024. So that's a lot of data that can bring us information of what's happening across the oceans. So now back to forced labor. I was saying that what we can get from AIS is what we can use as covariates for the model. And after talking with human rights experts, and this part was led by partners at UCSB, so University of California, Santa Barbara, we get a list of vessel characteristics and vessel behaviors that could help us to feed a model and be able to classify on forced labor. So the vessel characteristics are gear type, use of flag of convenience, engine power, vessel length, vessel tonnage, presence and IUU list. And vessel behavior, remember this is at the year scale because of the data constraints, are daily fishing hours, total fishing hours on the high seas, fishing hours in foreign EZs, number of transshipments, voyage duration, number of port visits, and others. So these are some of those. And I just said that this is a machine learning approach. So we are not giving exact rules to the model on what to look for. The model will find the patterns based on the data, based on what is happening with the reported cases, what those vessels did. And is trying to find the associations with these vessel characteristics and behaviors. There can be very complex associations, and all of these vessel behavioral patterns were calculated by other algorithms at Global Fishing Watch using the AIS data. If there are some questions about this, I can gladly take them after if people want more details. I am going to skip the PU modeling approach, but also glad to talk about it after. But this is what it looks like. This is kind of the architecture of the model from how we go from this data and the features that I just listed into a final classification into positive and negative for forced labor. And this is, of course, a model, and the model can get it wrong. So I'm just going to go through the slides very quickly and then go to the model performance. So for this, we use two metrics. One is sensitivity and the other one's specificity. Sensitivity is the proportion of true positives over the total positives of the model. Basically, that means that from all the reported cases of forced labor, how many the model is classifying as forced labor. And that proportion through different iterations and versions of data and tweaking of the model has given us something between 0.88 and 1 meaning perfect result. So this is not that bad. Specificity would be the proportion of true negatives over total negatives. So how many non-forced labor cases is the model classifying correctly as non-forced labor? And I previously said that we're using a PU learning approach because we only have positives and unlabeled. What we also had was some confidential information from some ports in the world that gave us um, results from inspections and also certifications on some vessels from a C188 regulation that is about, it's an international standard for living and working conditions at sea. So we had evidence of some vessels, let's say, being very good in this aspect, but we didn't want to rely on that 100% and say, let's train on this. We just use it for comparison afterwards and say it and see if the model was given results that were consistent with those certifications. And again, for different iterations of the model, we found results from 0.75 to 1. So that is also relatively good. And with those, accounting for those results in terms of model performance, we then go to what the model is estimating as the actual proportion of forced labor in the world, or at least with the vessels that have fishing vessels that have AIS data that we've trained and predicted for. So that would be between 0.14 and 0.38. So between 14% and 38% of the vessels we analyzed. Now, we have to take into account, and I should say and remind that there were major limitations relying on the data for training and testing, as I previously discussed. And we are working as well on the fairness of the model for different fishing gears, meaning if the model is equally reliable for drifting longliners, squid jiggers, trawlers, purse seiners, or is it doing a better job at some of them? And the same for flag regions. So, and we don't have enough data to validate and say for each flag, but basically, is the model being equally reliable for vessels that have flags from Asia and flags from other regions in the world? And this can only be checked in terms of sensitivity because of the poor amount of negatives that we have to check the model for now, and the not just the amount, but the lack of diversity of those vessels. So these are things that we're taking into account in this project. So that this is the first part of the presentation. Now, this model was to be able to identify potential vessels with forced labor, and it was done independently for each vessel. But forced labor doesn't always occur in isolation. And here I'm going to talk about two cases that I have found in NGO reports, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Case one, in 2003, H from Myanmar went to work in Thailand, where he was sold to work on an Indonesian fishing boat. He departed Samut Sakhon on board a reefer towards Indonesia. In 2004, he arrived in Ambon to work aboard the fishing vessel Wijaya 29. On board, he was beaten, abandoned by the captain on the Tanimbar Islands. Then H was re-trafficked onto another fishing vessel, Manhattan Arujaya 12. In 2013, he returned to Samut Sakhon, and he took carrier vessel Marine One to Ambon. In case two, in 2014, Y arrived in Samut Sakhon. He took a boat to Indonesia. On board, he worked 20-hour days on fishing vessel Aramina Pusaka 718 for 15 months. Then the vessel returned to port in Ambon every 3 months to load catch onto Marine One. So I'm just showing two examples of reported cases of forced labor. and they happened in different times, but there are some things in common, like some boats, and not necessarily the boat where forced labor happened, but boats that either transported them or had a role in transporting catch. Um, there could be other examples where other boats were encountered for providing fuel to these vessels and food. There is also commonalities in terms of ports. So these are things that this first model that I just showed doesn't take into account. So that meant that we needed a new method to assess the connections between vessels and forced labor through encounters at sea. Encounters, we define them as meeting each other at sea to transship, catch, supply food, fuel, and others, or to transfer crew. And at Global Fishing Watch, I just mentioned before, for the previous model, we use a series of algorithms to identify different types of behaviors using AIS data. Here, what we use for encounters is a heuristic approach that is basically, we say that there's an encounter when two vessels are very close to each other for a reasonable amount of time, traveling at very low speeds, and not so close to the coast. That's what we use to define encounters at sea. And the first method that we're using here is something called stochastic block models of forced labor vessels, which models the relationships between the vessels and assumes that there are some hidden groups within those networks. And that's what we're interested in, to find those groups and see if there are connections that we need to dig into more. So let's say that this is a network on the right side. The nodes are represented by different vessels. Some could be fishing vessels, some others could be cargo, reefer, other vessels. And the links between them are their encounters at sea. So we have around 300 vessels in reported cases. And this first stage of the analysis takes into account these vessels plus the vessels that encountered them. Once we have modeled this and identified some groups on this, we also project this over all the other vessels in the world and their encounters. So more than 200,000 vessels. And we compute the distance of each vessel to forced labor. So a distance of 0 would be you are the vessel with a reported case of forced labor. A distance of 1 would mean that you encountered the forced labor vessel. A distance of 2 is that you encountered the vessel that encountered the one with forced labor, and so on. So I'm just going to skip all the statistical details of the modeling, and I'll just go briefly to the results. We found 3 groups of vessels in this first stage of the networks. So the vessels that have forced labor and those that encounter them. There's the group 2 that has a higher connectivity within itself. So vessels in group 2 are more likely to encounter each other. And then we have vessels in group 1 and 3 that vessels in group 1 encounters those in vessels in group 3. And that's shown in the graph on the right side. So green is group 2, the ones that encounter themselves. And cluster 1 is the ones that are represented in red, and cluster 3, the ones represented in blue. So you see that blue and red encounter each other. There are 22 vessels in group 1, 26 in group 2, and 128 in group 3. So now we zoom in the cluster that has the highest connectivity, cluster 2, and we're still investigating. These are preliminary results. We're still investigating the characteristics of these vessels. There were 16 fishing and 3 non-fishing vessels that were reported to use forced labor in this cluster, and 7 fishing vessels that were not in the reports. The 23 fishing vessels fished in the North Indian and North Pacific Ocean. There were 22 vessels flagged with China, and they were also Chinese owned. There was one Panama, one Nauru, and one Dominica flagged, but the three of them, the Panama, Nauru, and Dominica, were Hong Kong owned. 19 vessels were owned by two companies identified as top owners of vessels accused of forced labor, according to a report. The two most visited port states were China and Malaysia. Now, we are, as I said, we are investigating a bit more those characteristics of cluster 2. So I will have more information later. So now we are projecting the network to all other vessels in the world with AIS data using encounters. As I mentioned, that means more than 200,000 vessels. And the graph at the left-hand side is a subset of those. I'm still having trouble trying to plot everything. If there are any network plotting experts here, please tell me how to do it. So I'm just going to go to the characteristics of those with a distance of 1 to those vessels. So the ones that encounter vessels of forced labor, many have changed characteristics over the years. Identity, flags, so it has been difficult to follow. The most common flags of these vessels were China, Panama, Korea, and Liberia. The most common owner flags, so not the flag of the vessel, but the flag of the owner, were China, Korea, Singapore, and Hong Kong. 269 vessels were foreign owned, meaning that it's not the same flag of the vessel and the owner. The majority of these vessels were squid jiggers and reefers. So these are a few of the characteristics. Again, we're doing a lot more work investigating these vessels, and the ownership is also very tricky. So what is next? We are tracking more details on the history of the vessels with shorter distance of forced labor. We are going to add port visits to the network model. So which ports are being visited by the vessels with forced labor cases, but also with the ones that are enabling those vessels to stay at sea for so long. We might try a Bayesian approach to account better for uncertainty in the data. And we also want to turn the outputs of these investigations into public or private products. There are a few data ethics questions there. What can be shared and how public each output of our models should be? Whose points of view should be included in these decisions? And we're talking about the people who will either use this to make change, and the people who can be victims of this or accused of this. So fishers, but also vessel owners and captains of vessels. So this is there are questions that we want to answer, and they're very sensitive and important to us. Such as it's about how we share the data and how public it should be, but also how to develop it in a way that it can be useful, and then how to develop it collaboratively with the people who would use these products to improve living and working conditions at sea. So governments, industry, unions, fisher associations, NGOs, and others. So that is what is coming next. There's a lot of work, but also we want to make sure that we can build avenues for change. And I am going to stop it there. This is my email account in case you have any questions that we are not able to answer today. But I thought it would be good to leave time for questions and discussions. So I'm stopping here.
Thank you, Rocio. very interesting work. We've got a few questions. The first one that's online is, do we know what percentage of DWF use AIS? Is the sample size sufficient for prediction?
Can you repeat what the
Sorry.
percentage of?
What percentage of DWF use AIS?
I guess that might be what percentage of our data. That's difficult to say what percentage of the data, but actually, I think the percentage of the vessels depends on it's not the same proportion depending on the length of the vessels. And I I need to make sure about this statistic, but I think it could be around 20, I would say 25% I've seen in an investigation, but it could be higher for I think it's a lot higher for the larger vessels. And the larger vessels, in theory, but this could be an assumption, a wrong assumption, could be the ones that do the longer trips and stay the longest at sea and have more risk of forced labor. But also, this could be the ones we could be missing others. So I hope I didn't give a really good answer at this. And we are also trying to find out better how many vessels are hiding from this. And actually, um, there's some work in object detection in our research team that is using other imagery data and other types of data to see all those vessels that don't transmit AIS data. And there's also work on seeing the encounters of this. So a vessel that we see with objects and the other vessel that we see with AIS. So that is like very preliminary work that is starting.
Okay. William, you have a question? Do you want to just jump in with it yourself?
Yes, thank you so much. And that's very interesting. Your last part of your answer answered the question that I initially had about like whether there would be deliberate turning off of the AIS data. And I think maybe just a quick follow-up on that is whether you expect that like more publication of this work that highlights these problematic activities would actually stimulate more vessels who are committing those activities to actually switch off their AIS, which has both kind of monitoring implications, but then also safety implications as well. And maybe as just a quick second question, if you may, also, how do you see the usefulness of like showing these activities? Would that be supporting monitoring and surveillance and control, or maybe more at the general levels about putting that as a setting agenda for international fisheries management policy discussion? Thanks.
Thank you, William. So I just wanted to say that another type of regarding your first question, another type of data that we use is also, but what we have not included in the forced labor models yet is VMS, so vessel monitoring system data, which is data that is enforced by different governments. So it might have different formats, but sometimes if you're not obligated to transmit AIS, if you enter the exclusive economic zone of a country, that country may force you to transmit VMS. So that's another source. So one line of work at Global Fishing Watch is also to be able to merge all these different sources of data to have a more complete picture of what's happening in the ocean. Regarding your second question, we are still discussing a lot internally, but we want to explore different approaches. And like one of these is basically for people like NGOs or journalists or public in general to be able to use our research either to raise more awareness or to be more aware of this problem themselves, and to get it to public attention, because forced labor is such a complicated problem, that there might be some other problems in different countries, and this might not get prioritized. So this is one of the avenues, but the other one is to, I was talking about developing products, and the idea is to, well, this is again something we're discussing, but to help governments, you're right, to use this data to kind of do more inspections on vessels that could be more suspicious according to the models, if they need to prioritize because they cannot do inspections to everybody that goes to the ports, to use this information. Now, there are some challenges as well, because not all governments right now do port inspections in terms of labor violations or human rights. In fisheries, it's more common to, in general, to worry more about what fish you're catching, and not so much about the conditions, the work conditions and living conditions at sea. So that is another challenge. We would also love it to kind of empower people to not just do port inspections, but Coast Guard inspections with this. But there should also be mechanisms later, and that's, I guess, on the governments to see if they find a forced labor condition on board a vessel. Do they have the mechanisms in the country to protect those people? What are they going to do with those people? If can they help them or not, or are they going to be deported? That is something that we are not doing, but we are conscious that that is also very important in this work. And other uses would be for the seafood industry. So the seafood industry, or many people that we've talked to, have a lot of interest in making their supply chains more transparent. But there's a part of the supply chain, which is where they buy the fish from. They don't know what the vessels are doing, and we want to help there. And we are being clear on what we're doing is models. It's based on algorithms. It might not be exactly the truth. The model can get it wrong, but maybe that can give you enough support to go to those vessels and say, hey, this is what the models are saying. Can you present information that will say that it's wrong, basically? Can you present the health insurance of the workers? Can you present their contracts? Different things. And we also want to help unions and associations of fishers and fishers themselves, if we can present, if this can support the evidence of labor abuses, if they have cases of labor abuses, and this can complement what they have. Again, also knowing that this comes from models, that is also another use that we see.
Okay, I'm going to turn to an online question. Since Global Fishing Watch has sort of amassed this rather large database on fishing activity, there's a question on whether anyone on your team has ever worked on linking this with the location of MPAs, marine protected areas, or if not, how an external researcher might be able to do that.
We haven't done the connection between forced labor and MPAs, and I would love to know like what's the rationale behind that. But we do have a team that is working on biodiversity topics and MPAs, and we have a tool called Marine Manager, where people can see both vessel activity and the shape files of the MPAs, the regions, and people can even create their own workspaces if they go to our public map on our website. and work and do some analysis. And if you do have some other analysis that are either not enough from what we show in the platform, or yeah, there are some technical issues, you can contact us and we can see if we can either help you with the technical issues or if this is an opportunity to establish a research collaboration.
Okay. Marie, you have a question? Would you like to ask it?
Yes, I have many questions, but I'll stick with two related questions. So thank you. That was a great talk. Can you tell me in your first analysis what were the characteristic of the boats that seem to be doing forced labor? And then in the second analysis, your cluster 2, I might have missed it, but can you tell me whether all of the boats had those movement characteristic, or did some didn't look like they were doing forced labor?
Okay, so for the first question, I'm just going to say something general, but again, because the model doesn't aim at identifying the characteristics themselves, and there are so many complicated rules, it's just, it shouldn't be taken, I mean, I, I'm saying it for everybody in the audience, it shouldn't be taken it as a rule. Um, we have observed that most of them, and the model has also shown that this really depends on the fishing gear. So because a drifting longline will have different behavioral patterns than a trawler and a squid jigger and so on. So there's a lot of combinations that have to take into account those types of characteristics. So gear is one of them that the model really uses to take into account all the other mix. But really high, in general, really high number of fishing hours in the year and in the day. Gaps as well, gaps in the transmission of AIS, because AIS is irregular in terms of time steps. So very large gaps. Then very few port visits. That was also an indicator, and very long voyages as well. So those were some of the most important ones, but there were others that were also used by the model, like transshipments or encounters as well. And yeah, yeah, all of the different characteristics were used by the model, but those were, I would say, the ones that jumped.
Okay.
I'm sorry, the second question was?
It's okay. There's tons of other questions, and I'll talk to you later. So yeah.
Okay.
Okay. The next question is a little specific to the modeling, but the question is, how do you infer or choose the number of groups in the SBM?
Oh, with a likelihood criterion. So that was there's an adapted integrated classification likelihood, so ICL criterion, and this is the reference. But if you want the complete reference, you can send me an email. So it's a model selection criterion where we compare different number of blocks, so 2, 3, 4, 5, and there's an important difference there. But so that was the first criterion, and the second one was that we could actually interpret the parameters of the model with the 3 groups. If we couldn't, then we would have gone to like the second choice of according to ICL.
Okay, thanks. On a broader non-statistical question, there's a question whether there's a plan to associate your work with the Minderoo Foundation Slavery Index.
We have actually done most of this work under Minderoo grants, but we haven't explored or worked with them on adding this to the fishery slavery index or the work that they do. We have given them data that comes out of our work. So I guess that if they see the potential to add this for the index that you're using, that we would be happy to participate in those conversations. But they are aware and supporting this work.
Yeah. Back to more of a modeling question. The speaker asks, if they understood correctly, you projected group 2 encounter characteristics onto the global fleet. Patterns of encounter between groups 1 and 3. Is there an explanation for these encounters that is not suggestive of forced labor?
So we actually projected the rest of the network. So it was like, sorry, here, where is this? So we actually generated an empirical network with all of the vessels. We didn't really project the cluster 2. That's the first part. And the second part is, so cluster 1 and 3. So in cluster 1 and 3, vessels encounter each other. And there are, I'm not sure of this, but in most cases, I wouldn't say 100% of these cases, as you see in the graph, the red dots are at the center of these networks. In most of these cases of the red clusters, those are forced labor vessels. So, and these encounters had to be with a reported case of forced labor. Now, there is an interesting aspect that we can't really prove that any vessel that encountered a forced labor vessel was intentionally participating in forced labor. But if there was an intention on the encounter, and there was an intention probably based on providing food, fuel, transferring catch or transferring crew, then there is a participation in enabling forced labor, even if it's unconscious. But yes, we cannot prove that there is something on forced labor here. And when we project on the networks here, and there are distances that are larger than 1, if a vessel encountered a vessel that encountered forced labor, it doesn't mean that it intentionally participated in forced labor either, but they are participating in enabling at a longer distance. So yes, that's what I can say about this.
Yeah. And then I think we have time for one last question, and that's, you know, you've talked about the model, and you've talked about how it really is only a predictive model, but it seems to me that your ultimate goal is to contribute to some sort of enforcement. So how do you see that progressing, either on its own, or what kind of other data would you need to actually take it from the modeling stage to the enforcement?
I think I'm not the best person qualified to answer that question, but I'm going to try. I think that this is I shouldn't say which kind of data we need, but I should say that we need to work with people who are actually going to use this data. So that's why I was talking about the governments, the NGOs, the ITF, and ITF, which is the International Transport Workers Federation, and others, to see what they actually need. And how, like, we can provide models like this, but in which way the outputs can translate into useful tools for them. I think that that's one of the most important questions. And the other important question is, it really doesn't matter how much data we give if the other part is not progressing. So the part where people are ready to do the inspections, people are ready to, like, governments are ready to do inspections, governments that have the vessels in terms of the vessels are wearing their flags, but also governments that have given permissions to use their EEZs, governments that give permissions to use their ports, but also the seafood industry. Are they also ready, the different groups in the seafood industry, to put pressure on those vessels and ask for more transparency and champion the good ones? what are the indicators that they need to be able to champion the good ones, and to ask for even more information to the ones that are more suspicious. So I think that the data question in this case has to be answered by the users, that the ones who can make change. And the only thing I can say about my models in general is that I will need like more data and more diverse data, so more data with different characteristics of reported cases of forced labor, help to train the models better and to make it more robust. But different types of data, that will depend on users.